Hello everyone, this is Jen and I make useful English Lit study videos on Shakespeare, poetry, fiction, literary devices and more to help you get top grades in the subject. So in today's video we are going to be doing another one of those essay walkthroughs, and specifically I am going to be using the same AQA GCSE English Lit 2021 19th century novel paper that I had used for my other essay walkthrough videos on A Christmas Carol and Jekyll and Hyde. So if you haven't seen those already and you're interested in top grade essay walkthroughs on those specific texts, then please go ahead and click on the links that I'm now flashing across in the top right hand corner of the video. But otherwise today we are going to be doing an essay walkthrough on Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. So we're going to be working on this specific extract that you see on the left here, and it's taken from letter 4 in Frankenstein, and specifically it comes at the start of the novella as written by the narrator Robert Walton, addressed to his sister Margaret. So for those of you who have studied or are studying this novella, you'll probably know that the narrative structure of this novella is very much kind of like a narrative within narrative within narrative, a sort of enveloped narrative structure, kind of embedded, kind of like onion layers, right? With narrator Robert Walton's narrative enveloping Victor Frankenstein's narrative, enveloping Frankenstein's monsters narrative. We're going to be looking at this specific extract today, and the question that we are given for this is, starting with this extract, explore how far Shelley presents Victor Frankenstein as a victim of his own actions. And as always with these questions, it's the same kind of format, 30 marks for us to write about how Shelley presents Victor Frankenstein in the extract, and also how far the author presents Victor Frankenstein as a victim of his own actions in the novel as a whole. So pretty much par for the course. Look at the extract, but also engaging with the text as a whole. So as always, I am just going to very quickly remind us of those assessment objectives for your GCSE English Lit paper. And you have your standard AO1, 2, 3, which are respectively for you to interpret textual evidence in a critical style, making sure that you are, if you're going for top grades, you are showing a judicious, conceptualized response using ample and relevant quotations to support and illustrate your analysis. And then with AO2, specifically for you to look at the language form and structure, and basically the writer's methods in creating meanings and effects, and of course bringing in subject terminology where it's appropriate, and also being able to explain how the subject terminology, in which case it would be literary devices, narrative devices, formal devices, etc., how they will lend themselves to creating thematic meaning and helping us develop a deeper understanding of the text. And then with AO3, it is looking at how the context in which the text was written relates or are manifested in the extract or the text as a whole. Now, of course, with AO4, it's just making sure that you are using good vocabulary and clear, concise language and sentence structure. And of course, with your standard kind of accurate grammar, spelling, punctuation, whatnot. So let's begin. The extract comes as a flashback episode at the start of the novel, when Frankenstein is presented in a weakened state through the narrative perspective of Robert Walton, whom the scientist encounters as he escapes from his monstrous creation's pursuit. So as a introductory sentence, this is great because the student is immediately showing us her awareness of where the extract is situated, and also using a relevant subject terminology, in this case being a narrative device flashback, right, to show us her awareness, right? And so very quickly she's already showing us a sort of higher level understanding of the text from a narrative perspective. She's showing us that she's going to be engaging with this extract with a strong awareness of where it is positioned in the greater context of the novel, with these words flashback and narrative. And also she's able to situate it, telling us specifically what is the situation that frames this extract that's given to us. And then she goes on to say, at this point, Frankenstein is cast in a largely sympathetic light. Great, because it summarizes what she thinks of Shelley's approach to characterization. And she's not simply just saying Shelley is showing Frankenstein as a victim or as a weakened, emaciated figure, right? She's showing us already the orientation of the author towards the protagonist. While the start of the extract suggests there is something else that Frankenstein prioritizes above his survival, and therefore willingly subjects himself to physical suffering, the rest of Shelley's description presents the scientist as a victim not simply of his own doing, but of greater natural forces far beyond the power of his control. So I would, of course, encourage you to go back to the past paper yourself and have a read of the extract. But essentially in the extract, what's going on is Frankenstein, before he is willing to board the ship that's led by Walton and his crew, he asks this bizarre question where he says, oh, before I join your ship, whereabouts are you headed? Walton obviously finds that bizarre because he's like, you're in this emaciated state on the brink of death. Why wouldn't you just want to latch onto this one chance at survival, right? Why are you still asking such a seemingly irrelevant question? And so the student is able to identify this hook and engage with the question, because the question is asking us to what extent is the author showing us that Frankenstein is a victim of his own actions, is responsible for his own tragedy, his own state, right? And so here she says, well, by asking this seemingly trivial question vis-a-vis the importance of his survival, he's seemingly subjecting himself to physical suffering. But then she goes on to say, but if we look at the rest of Shelley's description in the extract, we see that actually the scientist, Victor Frankenstein, is really not even powerful enough to subject himself to tragedy. In fact, he is very much subject to greater natural forces far beyond the power of his control, right? So he's actually a victim of greater forces. So then she goes on to summarize this in a crisp, clear thesis statement by saying, in this essay, then, I will analyse how Frankenstein is presented in this extract as a victim primarily of external circumstances, right? So the greater natural forces, but also to a substantial degree of his personal actions with reference to other moments from Shelley's novel, right? So she's saying in this extract, Frankenstein is shown more as a victim of greater forces beyond his control. But then if we look at the novel as a whole, then yes, there's definitely a solid case to be made for Frankenstein very much being a victim of many of his own actions and decision-making as well. Okay, so super clear with this intro, with this thesis statement wrapping up and signposting us, leading us seamlessly into the main body section. At the start of the extract, Walton is bewildered by Frankenstein's reservation about boarding the vessel, because he cannot understand how such an emaciated man on the brink of destruction would not jump on this precious opportunity for rescue. So yeah, bringing in this specific textual evidence quotation from the text. Placed early in the novel, so you see the student at every turn, she's showing a very sharp awareness of being able to engage with the extract in the context of the novel and the novel's narrative as a whole, right? So this sort of macro awareness of the positioning of an extract in the text as a whole is super important. So placed early in the novel, this enigma functions as a narrative hook, bringing in another subject terminology here, right? Starting to engage with the narrative structure, the writer's craft. as it reinforces the suspense around the seemingly illogical response from Frankenstein and entices the reader to continue with the narrative for clues as to what else the scientist could care more about other than his survival. Entices the reader to continue with the narrative. So this is very much the function, how the writer's craft use of this narrative hook here creates this effect on the reader. Yeah. At this moment then, it would appear from both the narrator and the reader's perspectives that Frankenstein has his priorities in the wrong order and is, as such, sabotaging his life by asking such a seemingly trivial and untimely question. We see the student bringing it back to engaging with the question. So is he turning himself into a victim of his own actions by asking such a question? Right, so it seems like that's the case, right? When we first start reading the extract and we see this from the use of this befuddling question as a narrative hook. So all the components of AO2, AO1, all of it is here. And obviously with the AO3, we're going to find out as we carry on in the next paragraphs.
By the way, guys, I'd massively appreciate it if you could hit the thumbs up button below, subscribe to my channel, and switch on that bell notification if you find this video helpful so far. This would really help me carry on making these useful English Lit study videos so that you can get top grades in the subject and we can inspire more people to enjoy the study of literature.
As the extract develops, however, the vivid descriptions of Frankenstein's dire physical state suggests that the scientist is also, if not ultimately, a victim of nature. So I just want to draw your attention to this sentence here being a very clear topic sentence, right? So this is what we call a clear topic sentence because it clarifies for us what the focus of this paragraph is going to be, which is looking at Shelley's portrayal of Frankenstein's dire physical state and how that kind of shows us he is in fact a victim, not just of his own doing, but of a greater force, which is in this case nature. Yeah, so super clear. So this is actually just the point. So super clear here, right, telling us, okay, this is exactly what I'm going to be looking at for the rest of the paragraph. As a result of the cold, Morton observes that Frankenstein's limbs were nearly frozen and his body dreadfully emaciated by fatigue and suffering as a man in so wretched a condition. So ample textual evidence here, and let's see how the student presents the interpretation here. So she says, the semantic field of unsightliness, subject terminology alert, yeah, semantic field of unsightliness, is borne out by the words dreadfully and wretched. Great, okay, so not only is the student bringing in the subject terminology, she's specifically picking out those words in the quotations that she sourced to tell us, these are the specific examples of the semantic field, keeping it specific, which ironically reminds us of the monster and suggests a disturbing affinity between man and beast. So here, the irony is in characterizing this human, who's obviously, as we know, created the monster, but here we see that the character himself is more like the monster, right? Which, as we go on to see in this essay, we'll know that later on in the novel, Frankenstein, in fact, uses these very same words to describe his monster. Meanwhile, words such as fatigue and suffering reinforce Frankenstein's defeat vis-a-vis the much greater, more potent agent of inclement weather and harsh temperatures. So here showing us, given that Frankenstein here is presented in the state of fatigue and suffering, then we actually see that Frankenstein has very much been kind of defeated, at least physically defeated, by the harsh weather and the bitter cold of the environment. And then the student says, this notion of man at the mercy of nature is aligned with the romantic concept of the sublime, which ascribes an almost deistic invincibility to the natural world. Wonderful. So bringing in a super important piece of contextual knowledge, which is in Romanticism, there's this idea of the sublime, this kind of luminous force that's terrorizing, but at the same time awe-inspiring, kind of thinking about massive mountains, humongous structures in nature. All of these structures instill in us this fear, but also this sense of worship of the wonder of nature. This idea of nature very much having the upper hand over these minuscule human beings, despite us individually thinking of ourselves as incredible advanced beings. We're very much still at the mercy of natural forces and nature's power. Juxtaposed alongside Frankenstein's daring experimentation of creating a sentient being, the sentient being here being the monster, which in a Christian framework could also be viewed as a kind of sacrilegious aping of God's work, the scientists we can state here may be a reminder of the need for man to acknowledge the limits of his cosmological authority. Right, so this student, first of all, tells us that she's thinking about the context very much in parallel to the fictional happenings, right? So she's saying, okay, we think about this action of essentially creating some new character, right? Almost like a pseudo-human character. And we think about this in a Christian framework, which of course, Christianity was very much the kind of dominant mode of understanding the world, at least back then. So most people believed in Christianity. So in that sort of framework where God is the ultimate source of authority, being able to create any sort of living and breathing creature is God's exclusive right. And yet here you have this mortal Victor Frankenstein trying to imitate the work of the ultimate source of authority. And as such, there's bound to be some kind of repercussion. And here very much, his physical defeat is perhaps a manifestation of the sort of punishment, right, from God. And it serves as a kind of caution, right, a sort of cautionary reminder of the need for man to recognize his limits and to recognize that such Faustian overreaching will see disastrous consequences for man, as nature, the ultimate force, will backfire on actions which counter the natural order. So here, another piece of contextual knowledge. This time, I think this is more advanced, but for your reference, right, Faustian. This is very much alluding to Dr. Faust. In Renaissance literature, you have Christopher Marlowe's Dr. Faustus, right, this play about the scholar whose intellectual ambitions lead him to this disastrous decision of selling his soul to the devil, Mephistopheles. And it's very much, you see how, there's shadows of what Frankenstein here is doing. In exchange for this sort of intellectual, scientific ambition, he overreaches his boundaries, at least in the Christian framework. So this student is weaving in all kinds of contextual knowledge to support and illuminate and elevate her interpretation of the text. So as we go on, she says, despite presenting Frankenstein as a fallible man who has invited his own misfortunes, Shelley frames her protagonist in a compassionate light, and as such conveys a strong wish for her reader to view Frankenstein not with judgment, but with pathos. This is wonderful because, well, first of all, the student uses a clear signposting word, despite presenting, right? So here she's showing us. We're going to somewhat slightly shift the angle where we're looking at how we're looking at the characterization here. And we're going to elevate this a little bit more and to look at how the author actually isn't just presenting her scientist as this victim of external or even internal circumstances, not in a just kind of like a literal way, but looking at it in a compassionate way, right? How she activates pathos. I think pathos here is an important word, right? Pathos, also this idea of appealing to the reader's emotions, right? This sense of sympathy, right? She wants us to sympathize with Frankenstein, right? And especially since this comes at the start of the novel, it's important for us to not start off by just kind of being in this position where thinking that this protagonist is something that we're just going to judge in this sort of absolute black and white sort of moralistic framework. And of course, with literature, it's always worth thinking about characterization and not in a moralistic sort of didactic didactic way, but in a deeper kind of humanistic way. And of course, that's kind of how the student is looking at Shelley's characterization here, right? In a more humanistic and not a moralistic light. Far from painting his victimhood here as a result of karmic comeuppance, this idea of karma, right, having your just apples. I think this is a good example of AO4, actually, using sophisticated vocabulary, but in an accurate, concise way. Shelley portrays Frankenstein as a victim of fascinating contradictions and human complexity through the lens of Walton, telling us that she's very much aware of the narrative perspective through which this character is shown. And of course, you know, because Walton doesn't really understand Frankenstein, where Frankenstein is really coming from at this stage in the novel. When he was writing this letter, he can't really empathize with the seemingly weird kind of question that Frankenstein seems to be asking him, right? So there's a kind of a limited omniscience kind of narrative here, so showing us the limits of his ability to empathize. On the one hand, Frankenstein's eyes have generally an expression of wildness and even madness. Equally, he emits a beam of benevolence and sweetness that Walton never saw equaled whenever anyone performs an act of kindness towards him. So again, bringing in quotations. So looking at then how the student unpacks these quotations. The synecdochic focus, synecdoche, right? Use of part for whole, on his animated eyes characterizes Frankenstein as a sort of visionary figure. But the paradoxical quality of them containing both madness and docility perhaps reflects the irreconcilable struggle that resides within and haunts the scientist. Again, the student brings in this quotation, but then zooms in specifically on the part, on the reference, right, the eyes, where there's a specific literary device that she can discuss, right? And she tells us that, by zooming in on Frankenstein's paradoxical eyes being both mad and yet gentle, we see him as this sort of visionary figure. Also, this idea, this paradox, is a reflection of his psychological struggle, right? Something that he seems to not be able to reconcile within him, and it bothers him. This also functions as a narrative hook, right? As a point of suspense, because we want to find out, what is it that just so bothers him? What is this struggle that so haunts him? We want to find out as we continue reading the novel. Indeed, that Frankenstein, or paradox here, sorry, is also a good use of subject terminology. Indeed, that Frankenstein is someone at once capable of deep regret over his actions, melancholy and despairing. So another quotation here that is an observation that Walton makes, and of raw anger over his fallen state, reflected in his gnashing of teeth, also speaks to the depth and humanness of the character. As such, by casting Frankenstein in a fallible but pitiable light early on in the narrative, Shelley reduces the level of moral judgment that readers may be tempted to pass on Frankenstein as the narrative about his diabolical course of action unfolds. So you see the student at every point, super tight links, right, and echoes between her analysis and interpretation. She tells us that at the start of this paragraph, she makes this argument that Shelley wants to present Frankenstein in a compassionate way and wants to appeal to the reader's pathos. And she ends this paragraph by bringing her analysis to a level where she's already substantiated this argument and also reminds us that this continues to be her stance, right? So making sure that your analysis and argument in your paragraph is super tightly linked from sentence to sentence, from argument to evidence to analysis to your summarizing statement. Everything has to be connected, okay? To make sure that you're communicating an integrity in the argument, okay, that you're putting forth. And this penultimate paragraph then, of course, we know is her zooming out and engaging with the text as a whole. Ironically then, Frankenstein is later revealed to be a victim of his own readiness to pass moral judgment, specifically on his very own monster. The student is able to identify with this clear topic sentence, what was I using for, okay, I was just using bold. super clear topic sentence here that links to the argument from the previous paragraph where she says it's ironic because whereas Shelley's characterization is to convey this wish for the reader to not judge Frankenstein, we later see that her protagonist falls into this trap of judging his own creation in this moralistic way, and of course as a result suffers for it. And in chapter 9, where Frankenstein confronts the monster about its destructive behavior, the scientist launches into a tirade chock full of demonizing diction here, use of words, calling the monster devil, abhorred monster, wretched devil. Right, at this point, when he confronts the monster, compared to the monster's sophisticated appeal to reason, which is reflected in the measured syntax and reciprocal patterning of his sentences, perhaps, the monster sentences, where he says, do your duty towards me and I will do mine towards you and the rest of mankind, right? Do yours towards me, I will do mine towards you, this reciprocal patterning. If you will comply with my conditions, I will leave them and you at peace, right? This kind of hypothetical syntax, appealing to reason and not this mad, chaotic, emotional outpouring. That's very much Frankenstein's mode of speech here. Frankenstein's resort to rage clouds his better judgment and vision over the situation, which leads him to the fateful decision of refusing to consider the monster's request and of declaring war against the monster. And of course here the implication is that, well, because he makes this fateful decision to not consider the monster's request, to not engage with the monster in civil negotiation, then of course that is what positions him as victim ultimately of his own actions, right? Exclaiming in negative superlatives and combative antitheses, lots of good subject terminology here, that there can be no community between you and me, right? No community between you and me, negative superlatives. We are enemies in a fight in which one must fall, right? Very much black versus white, you versus me, right? Good versus evil. With this, Frankenstein sets in action the start of his troubled plight. Here, telling us, hey, I'm answering the question. He is turning himself into a victim of his own action, and he must henceforth seek to escape the monster's wrathful retaliation, which he has arguably invited onto himself, actually, by dint of his close-mindedness. Telling us this is exactly why Frankenstein ultimately is also a victim, very much of his own decision-making, because of his refusal to engage with the monster as fellow human, right? So here, very much, we are bringing in another moment, a climactic moment, arguably, from elsewhere in the novel to counterpose this extract that we are given in the question. Okay? Final paragraph conclusion. On the whole, a broader idea that emerges from Frankenstein's struggle with this monster is the distinction between emotion and reason as different means of engaging with the world, a central philosophical concern bridging the Enlightenment and Romantic movements. So this student is definitely top grade and higher level, because here what she's doing is the student isn't just simplistically giving us like a conclusive statement and summary or reiterating her thesis statement of how Shelley characterizes Frankenstein in this extract or even in the novel. She's recontextualizing her argument within the historical context. She's able to identify this key overarching thematic concern, this dichotomy of how we engage with the world, how we understand beings around us, whether it be through emotional or logical ways. We see her situating this against the philosophical backdrop of the Enlightenment, the Romantic movement, because obviously the Enlightenment tradition was to deem reason as being superior to emotion, right? Whereas very much then you had the Romantic movement that followed, very much flipping that on its head and saying, actually, it's important for us to also engage with the emotional side of how we experience our world and surroundings, right? And that reason and logic aren't the be-all and end-all. And Shelley, together with her husband Percy Bysshe Shelley and the rest of the Villa Diodati Intellectual Salon, which was near Lake Geneva, where they stayed at frequently, where they would have these intellectual salons and get-togethers just to talk about literature and philosophy, right? Things that people apparently back then had time for, would have debated over such questions on occasions when they stayed at Lake Geneva. So this, not just philosophical or historical context or cultural context, but very much also bringing in biographical context. Frankenstein, as one who has invested too much faith into scientific reason, starts off as the Enlightenment representative, but as the narrative develops, his dismissal of the monster's emotional needs sheds light on whether science and reason are necessarily superior to the more human faculties of sympathy and intuition when one engages with the world. So the student is saying, I'm recontextualizing the novel, but I'm also mindful of bringing it all back to the extract and also the novel as a whole, right? So again, tight links between the text and the context here, very well illustrated. By positioning Walton's letter about encountering the frail Frankenstein at the start, Shelley implies that blind faith in scientific inquiry will inevitably lead to undesirable ends, which is illustrated very much by the rest of the narrative. All right, so there you go. I think pretty self-explanatory why this essay is a top grade specimen, and you'll see it's largely because obviously it hits with all of the AO, 1, 2, 3, and of course 4 is well written, but not just that, but is able to do so in a way where all the paragraphs link organically with one another to illustrate a central argument, right? And is able to not just look at the extract, not just look at the novel, but also to position it within the historical and cultural and also biographical context, and to present this complete essay. And that's it for this top grade Frankenstein essay walkthrough, everyone. So I hope this was helpful in terms of giving you a reference point for what a good top grade essay looks like in the context of writing these literary analyses. As always with these essay walkthroughs, the point is to inspire you guys to come up with your own unique ideas about the text and to be able to express them in your own writing. The point with these essay walkthroughs is never for you to just think of them as pieces of writing that you can copy, right, or even emulate. I'm sure a lot of you will be able to write just as well, if not even better. For those of you who want a copy of this essay, please as always email me with the information that's provided in the description box below. And if you found this valuable in any way, please do hit the thumbs up button below so that you can support me and that I can keep making these useful English Lit study videos to help you. And also for YouTube to know to share this with other passionate top grade English Lit learners all around the world so that we can help each other out here. Please comment below as well if you have any of your own thoughts or questions. Please also subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and switch on that bell notification so that you don't miss out on any of my weekly study videos going forward. And I will see you guys in the next one. Ciao!